Hello, Bible readers. It is Thursday, February 25th. We're reading from 1 Kings, chapter 20 to 22, and then 1 Corinthians, chapter 11. I'm starting at verse 1 through chapter 12, verse 11. So we've got it as 1 Kings comes to a conclusion and then just kind of goes right into 2 Kings. We've got Syria versus Israel. Israel being the northern kingdom, of course. And so Israel, you'll see as we see here, Israel's kind of a buffer between Judah and Syria. Syria is a big power at the time. So Ahab has a lot of people, but not as many, obviously, as Syria. And yet, he is successful in defending Israel. And I'm just going to read from this commentary here. Were a modern leader to have the kind of foreign policy success Ahab achieved, one might be inclined to overlook his or her minor offenses. If the country is strong and the economy is sound, we're content to overlook the personal flaws and excusable infractions of our leaders. This was written like 20 years ago, by the way, just so you know. Yet, Ahab is condemned for what seems to us like a very humane and far-sighted deed, the sparing of his enemy. I mean, this is a troubling section to see that, Ahab is seen as being unfaithful or not a good king simply because he spares his enemy. The notion of the ban that's associated with the assumptions of holy war is difficult for us to understand today. Yeah, I'd say so. It's one of those regulations in the Bible to which we must say no. Yeah, genocide, we say no. Yet, this passage of Scripture warns against our tendency to place pragmatic considerations ahead of a right relationship with God. It also warns us against making excuses for shunning our responsibility to the Lord, against claiming that we're too busy here and there to be preoccupied with matters that seem more pressing than do matters of faith. So it's using a terrible example to get at this idea that our devotion to and relationship with God are more important than anything else. The example here being you're supposed to wipe everybody out and you didn't. So bad example, we say no to that, but the idea of being faithful to God above all other concerns, we can run with that. So this is one of those times in Scripture where it's like, to take it literally. Well, does that mean that we're supposed to participate in genocide? This is where some Scripture interprets other Scripture. We've just had stories of Elijah being a prophet to a Gentile, God making use of a Gentile woman, God making use of an unclean animal, and now we've got genocide. Well, there are some pieces of Scripture that are more meaningful than perhaps others, and some Scripture interprets others. So that's what we mean by that. Okay, chapter 21, business transaction between unequal partners. You've got a king versus the king's citizens. It reminds us of like corporations versus small business, or superpowers versus developing nations. This passage lifts up a prophetic word against the manipulation of the legal and religious institutions to achieve such goals. The point being, when Ahab uses his privilege against his own citizens, God notices. God sees Ahab. It's the 10th commandment in practice. And then chapter 22, we've got Micaiah versus Ahab. Micaiah is obviously an unwelcome voice. Ahab remains blind to what God can do and calls us to do. And finally, then Ahab dies, and Jehoshaphat and Ahaziah finish up 1 Kings. Both kings fall short of God's demands. That is a theme of the kings at this point. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I'm going to go over a couple, maybe a minute or two here, because we get into a section that's really controversial within the letter to the Corinthians. We've got 3 worship practices of the community that are lifted up. Number 1, the woman's head covering. Number 2, the Lord's Supper. And number 3, the use of spiritual gifts. So chapter 11, everybody's least favorite chapter of 1 Corinthians. I've got 5 pages of commentary on this section alone about the woman's head covering because it's so contextual. The context of the time, I don't think we can fully enter into what Paul is getting at and why he feels so strongly about these pieces. Christ as head of men, men as head of women. The point of what Paul is saying is that none of us, no one of us is independently on a journey with God. That each one of us needs a source of strength, something to anchor us in faith. That a woman is supposed to have a man, that a man is supposed to have God, could a man have his source of strength in a woman? Yeah, I'll testify to that. I mean, that's what my wife is for me. So am I doing it wrong? That she is the head of my church? Or that we may mutually be each other's head, whatever Paul's speaking to? I'm not sure we're doing it wrong. So again, very contextual. And this is hard. Do we apologize for Paul? Do we try to explain Paul away? How do we read Paul's letters to be helpful to us in the 21st century? And then verses 17 to 34, unworthily taking part in the Holy Communion. I've had a lot of conversations about this too. What does that mean? What it means is you got to examine yourself and you've got to discern the body. It's about me taking stock of me and then taking stock of my relationship with God. That needs to be done if we are to faithfully take Holy Communion. Well, what if we don't? Does that mean we're going to hell? That's the next question. No, it does not, by the way. God's grace is bigger than whether or not I examine myself and discern the body correctly. Chapter 12, verses 4 to 11, he speaks to the significance of diversity. Your diversity is a sign of unity because you all need each other. No one of you is going to be able to do this all by yourself. So your diversity of gifts is not disunity, how different you all are. It's how much you all need each other. That is the most helpful idea to me of these three faith practices, that our diversity is a sign of our need for union, not our look how ununited we are. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us at all times and in all places.